There is a particular hour of the morning in the coastal communities of northeastern Brazil when the mangrove becomes something other than a landscape. It becomes a workplace. The transition happens in the dark, before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, when the tide has pulled back far enough to expose the gray-brown mud that lies underneath the mangrove's root systems. The aerial roots that arch out of the water and into the air in the distinctive tangle that makes the mangrove one of the most visually recognizable ecosystems on Earth. In that hour, before the heat of the day makes the work harder than it already is, before the tide begins its return and reclaims the mud that has been exposed, the catadores enter the mangrove. Men, women, children old enough to walk in mud without being pulled under. They come from the communities that line the coast of Maranhão and Pará and the other states where the mangrove forest meets the Atlantic, communities that have organized their entire existence around the rhythms of the tide and the productivity of the mud beneath it. They come carrying the tools of their work, which are in most cases their hands and a knife and a bag, and they go into the mud, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes knee deep, sometimes deeper, and they begin the work that has sustained their families for longer than anyone in those communities can remember, longer than any written record reaches, longer than the Portuguese language has existed on this coast. What they are looking for lives in that mud. It lives in the mud and on the roots and in the water that moves between the roots at high tide, and it has been living there for millions of years, long before humans arrived on this coast to discover that it was edible. The sururu is a small bivalve mollusk, a mussel, essentially in the way that the word mussel is understood outside Brazil, though the sururu has its own specific characteristics that distinguish it from the mussels of European or North American waters. It attaches itself to the submerged roots of the mangrove, growing in clusters that can cover entire root systems with a dark shell-covered mass, each individual sururu small enough to fit easily in the palm of a hand, its shell dark gray to black, the interior containing the soft organism that is the food. The caranguejo-uçá is something larger and more complex. A crab, the mangrove crab, whose full Portuguese name reflects its relationship with the specific environment that produces it. It lives in burrows in the mangrove mud, emerging at certain tidal conditions and in certain seasons to feed on the leaf litter and organic matter that accumulates on the mangrove floor, retreating back into the mud when conditions change, its life organized around the same tidal rhythms that organize the lives of the catadores who harvest it. These two creatures together, the sururu and the caranguejo-uçá, represent something that is easy to underestimate when you encounter them described in terms of what they are: small shellfish and mangrove crabs. The description does not convey what they mean in the communities where they are harvested. They mean protein in a coastal diet that has very few other reliable sources of it. They mean income for families who have no other productive resource beyond their knowledge of the mangrove and their willingness to enter it. They mean a food tradition that goes back to the beginning of human habitation on this coast that has been passed from generation to generation through the direct transmission of practice rather than through any written record. And that has sustained communities through every economic and environmental disruption that the coast of northeastern Brazil has experienced over the past several hundred years. They mean, in the most basic and the most profound sense, survival. And understanding what it takes to get them out of the mangrove mud and onto a plate is understanding something about the relationship between human communities and the environments they depend on that is worth understanding carefully. The mangrove itself is a prerequisite for everything. Without the mangrove, there is no sururu and no caranguejo-uçá, at least not in the concentrations and the accessibility that make the harvest viable. The mangrove is one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth in terms of the organic matter it generates. The leaf litter, the decomposing root material, the nutrients that flow through the system and support an extraordinary density of marine life. The sururu filters this organic matter from the water, growing on the very roots that produce it, embedded in an ecosystem that feeds it continuously and in return gets nothing except the waste products of its filtration, which happen to be exactly the kind of nutrient cycling that keeps the system productive. The caranguejo-uçá eats the leaf litter and the detritus, processing the organic material of the mangrove floor in ways that accelerate its decomposition and return its nutrients to the system. Both animals are, in ecological terms, part of the machinery of the mangrove rather than simply inhabitants of it. They are the mangrove eating itself and cycling what it eats back into what feeds it. The people who harvest them are, in turn, part of the same system, taking what the system produces, returning to it through the practices of their daily work, embedded in a relationship with the mangrove that has shaped their communities over centuries. The harvest of sururu requires a specific kind of physical intimacy with the mangrove that is difficult to fully convey without having experienced it, the catadora. And the sururu harvest in the coastal communities of Maranhão is predominantly women's work, a gender division that has its own history and its own social complexity. Enters the mangrove at low tide, moving through the root systems to reach the clusters of sururu attached to the submerged portions of the roots. The mud underfoot is deep, soft, and unpredictable. It can shift from firm enough to walk on to thigh deep and pulling in the space of a step, and the physical navigation of it requires constant attention and a body knowledge of how to read the surface that is acquired through years of practice. Children who grow up in these communities begin accompanying their mothers and grandmothers into the mangrove before they are old enough to harvest effectively, learning with their feet and their hands the specific texture of mud that will hold and mud that will not, the specific feel of root systems that can be used as handholds and root systems that will give way. The harvesting of sururu from the roots involves scraping or pulling the clusters of shellfish from the surface to which they have attached, working quickly and efficiently because the tide does not wait and the window of low tide access closes without negotiation. Experienced catadores can harvest significant quantities in the time available, quantities that reflect years of developing an efficient movement pattern through the root systems, an ability to identify the densest clusters by sight and by feel, and the physical conditioning that allows sustained work in conditions that most people who have not grown up with them would find extremely demanding. The mud, the heat, the insects, the physical difficulty of moving through a root system that is designed by its own growth logic rather than by any human convenience. These are the working conditions of the sururu harvest. They are accepted not because they are good conditions, but because they are the conditions that the work requires, and the work is what feeds the family. The sururu, once harvested, requires processing before it can be consumed. The shells contain not just the meat, but also the mud and organic matter of the mangrove environment, and the cleaning process is labor-intensive in its own right. The shellfish are washed repeatedly in the water available, seawater, river water, whatever is at hand, to remove the exterior contamination. The shells are then opened, the meat extracted, and in some preparations the shells are discarded, in others the sururu is cooked in the shell, the heat of cooking causing the shells to open and allowing the meat inside to be consumed directly. The flavor of the sururu is distinctly of the sea, briny, intensely marine, with a mineral quality that reflects the specific chemistry of the mangrove environment in which it grew. It is a strong flavor, not subtle, not something that reveals itself gradually on the palate. It arrives immediately and completely, and people who did not grow up eating it either find it extraordinary or find it too much, with relatively little middle ground. The preparation of sururu in the communities where it is harvested reflects the culinary intelligence of people who have worked with a specific ingredient for a long time and understand what it needs and what it can do. The simplest preparations involve cooking the sururu with water, garlic, and whatever aromatics are available. Cilantro, a small amount of pepper, producing a broth that is intensely flavorful, and that is consumed along with the meat, the liquid itself being nutritious and warming in a way that extends the value of the harvest beyond the protein in the shellfish. More elaborate preparations involve combining the sururu with coconut milk, a combination that reflects the broader culinary geography of the northeastern coast where coconut is abundant and its milk is used to moderate the intensity of strongly flavored seafood. The sururu with coconut milk served over rice or with the flatbreads of the region is a dish that has moved from the communities of catadoras to the tables of urban restaurants in cities like São Luís and Belém, where it is served as an expression of regional culinary identity, the specific flavor of a specific ecosystem brought to the city from the mangrove. The caranguejo-uçá harvest is a different kind of work, demanding different knowledge and a different relationship with the mangrove and its rhythms. The crab lives in burrows in the mangrove mud. tunnels that can reach half a meter or more in depth, extending below the water table of the mud, providing the crab with a refuge that is difficult to access without knowing specifically how to approach it. The traditional harvest technique involves reaching into the burrow to extract the crab directly, a process that requires the harvester to push their arm into mud up to the shoulder, feeling for the crab in the darkness of the burrow, grasping it in a way that avoids the claws, which are powerful enough to break a finger and which the crab will use without hesitation when threatened. The tactile skill involved in this, the ability to locate a crab in a dark mud burrow by feel, to distinguish the crab from the root material and debris that share the burrow, to grasp it securely without triggering the defensive response that makes it dangerous, is learned over years, beginning in childhood, and it is as specific and as practiced as any skilled manual work. The caranguejo harvest is predominantly men's work in the coastal communities of Maranhão and Pará, though the gender division is not absolute and the economics of the harvest are shared across the family. The harvest happens according to the crab's biology as much as according to human preference. The caranguejo-uçá has specific periods of the year when it leaves its burrows in larger numbers, particularly during the andada, the reproductive migration that happens during the rainy season when large numbers of crabs move across the mangrove surface simultaneously. During the andada, the harvest is more abundant and less physically demanding because crabs moving on the surface are more accessible than crabs in burrows. Outside the andada, the burrow-reaching harvest is the primary method, and the catadores who do it daily develop the arm strength, the pain tolerance, and the specific tactile intelligence that the work requires. The caranguejo-uçá is eaten in ways that are specific to the communities and the cooks who prepare it. The most characteristic preparation involves cooking the whole crab, typically by boiling or by the application of direct heat in a process that varies by community and by cook, and consuming the meat by breaking the shell apart to access the interior. The meat of the caranguejo-uçá is distributed throughout the body in ways that require both knowledge and patience to access fully. In the claws, in the legs, in the body cavity, in the hepatopancreas, that is considered a delicacy by people who know the crab well and an acquired taste by those who do not. The flavored cooking liquid left after boiling crab is itself used as a base for rice, as a sauce, as a broth, because in communities where the crab is both food and income, nothing that can be used is wasted. The economic structure of the sururu and caranguejo harvest is one of the most important things about it, and it is one of the things that is least visible to anyone outside the communities where it happens. The catadores and catadores are not employees of any organization. They are independent workers, their access to the mangrove governed by customary use rights that exist in parallel with, and sometimes in tension with formal legal frameworks. They sell what they harvest through chains of intermediaries. The atravessadores, the middlemen who buy from the catadores and sell to markets, restaurants, and urban distributors. And the price they receive for their harvest is almost always substantially less than the price at which the same product eventually reaches the consumer. The economics of the harvest, in other words, are characterized by the same structural disadvantage that characterizes extractive economies generally, where the people who do the most difficult and least replaceable work. The people with the specific knowledge of the environment, the physical capacity to do the work, the daily presence in the mud, receive the smallest share of the value that their work generates. The women who harvest sururu in the mangroves of Maranhão and Pará are among the lowest income workers in Brazil. The work they do is skilled, physically demanding, environmentally essential, and nutritionally critical to the communities they live in and to the broader food economy of the northeastern coast. It is also almost entirely invisible to the systems that measure economic value in ways that produce recognition, protection, and income. The catadora who enters the mangrove at 5 in the morning and spends 4 hours in mud up to her thighs harvesting sururu is doing something that the Brazilian economy depends on and that the Brazilian economy does not adequately compensate her for. The disconnect between the value of what she produces and the recognition she receives for producing it is one of the defining features of her situation and the situation of thousands of women like her across the coastal communities of northeastern Brazil. Children's participation in the harvest is both a practical reality and a point of significant complexity. In communities where the household income depends on the harvest, children accompany adults from an early age. Learning the work, contributing what their size and strength allows, developing the embodied knowledge of the mangrove that they will need as adults. This participation is on one level, the transmission of a cultural and practical inheritance, the specific knowledge of how to move in the mangrove, how to read the tide, how to find the densest clusters of sururu and the most productive burrows. That can only be transmitted through direct experience. On another level, it represents the use of child labor in conditions that are physically demanding and that take children away from school during the hours when the harvest is productive, with consequences for their educational opportunities and their ability to develop economic alternatives to the same work their parents do. The environmental situation of the mangroves where the harvest happens is a dimension of this story that cannot be left unaddressed. The mangrove forests of the northeastern coast of Brazil are under pressure from multiple directions. From shrimp farming that has converted significant areas of mangrove to aquaculture ponds, from coastal development that has degraded or destroyed mangrove areas near urban centers, from pollution that enters the mangrove from rivers and coastal communities and affects the quality and safety of the shellfish and crustaceans that grow in it, and from the longer-term effects of changing climate on the tidal and rainfall patterns that determine the mangrove's productivity. The catadores who depend on the mangrove understand these pressures from the inside. They see, over years and decades, the changes in where the carango is abundant and where it has become scarce, the changes in the size of sururu harvests from areas that were once productive and have declined, the appearance of pollution in areas that were once clean. They carry in their daily experience an environmental monitoring capacity that is more sensitive and more locally specific than any institutional system, because their livelihood depends on the health of the system in a way that no institutional monitoring program's funding depends on it. The sururu and the caranguejo-uçá are on restaurant menus in São Luís. They appear in the culinary identity of Maranhão as expressions of regional distinctiveness, as evidence of a food culture that is specific and deep-rooted and worth celebrating. They appear in the discourse of food journalists and cultural commentators as examples of the rich and underappreciated diversity of Brazilian cuisine. All of this is true, and the attention is not unwelcome. But between the restaurant menu and the mangrove is the woman who entered the mud at 5 in the morning, and the child who walked beside her learning what her feet need to know, and the tide that does not adjust its schedule to human convenience, and the burrow that goes deeper than an arm's length into mud, that is cold, even when the air above it is hot, and the intermediary who arrives with a scale and a price that has already been decided before the negotiation begins. The distance between the menu and the mud is not just physical. It is economic and social and historical, and it contains everything that is both extraordinary and unjust about the way that the food traditions of the sertão and the mangrove have been inherited, practiced, and rewarded across the generations of people who have kept them alive. The mangrove will be there tomorrow morning. The tide will pull back at the hour it has always pulled back. The sururu will be on the roots, and the caranguejo will be in the burrows, and the catadores will enter the mud in the dark, as they have always entered it, carrying the knowledge that no other community on earth possesses in quite the same form, doing work that no other workers in Brazil do in quite the same way, feeding a tradition and feeding families and feeding a food economy that depends on them without always acknowledging that dependence clearly or compensating it fairly. They will go in the dark. They will come back with what the mangrove gives them, and what the mangrove gives them, it gives because they know how to ask for it, and have known for longer than memory reaches exactly how that asking is done.